The morning of May 19, 1536, was unlike any ordinary dawn in Tudor England. It did not awaken with the familiar rhythm of London's heartbeat, nor with the cheerful bustle of market stalls and church bells. Instead, the day began under a shroud of silence, a silence so heavy that it seemed to bend the air itself. At the Tower of London, where stone walls had witnessed centuries of triumphs and tragedies, anticipation and dread weighed upon every corner. The cobblestones were slick with mist, and the Thames rolled sluggishly, its surface grey and still, as if the river too understood that history was about to demand a terrible offering. Anne Boleyn, the crowned Queen of England, once the most radiant jewel of Henry VIII's court, was to die that morning. Her fall from majesty had been swifter than the change of seasons, her destiny shaped not by divine justice but by politics, betrayal, and whispered lies. The city knew what was coming, and the city gathered to see it unfold. Crowds had been assembling since the first hint of dawn. Peasants and merchants, noblemen and courtiers, children clinging to their mothers' hands, all pressed forward toward the Tower Green. The great wooden scaffold had been erected in the center, standing tall, draped not in cloth but in the fog that lingered, awaiting its grim purpose. This was not simply an execution, it was a spectacle, a ritual of state power, meant to display not just the fall of a woman but the omnipotence of a king. Inside her chamber, Anne had risen early. Sleep had eluded her, but fear had not conquered her. Instead, she knelt in prayer by the faint flicker of a candle, her lips whispering quietly as she sought mercy not from men, but from God. She was not the trembling wretch her enemies had imagined she might become. She was resolved to face death with dignity, as if her composure might, in her final hours, restore some of the honor stripped from her by the trial and the slander. When the guards arrived to escort her, the creak of the door was like a groan from history itself. The echo rolled through the stone corridor as Anne stepped forward, her gown dark but elegant, her head held high. She wore a small headdress, plain yet dignified, and her long neck, the subject of so many poems and songs during her years of glory, was exposed. She looked neither like a criminal nor a defeated queen, but rather like a martyr walking steadily toward destiny. As she emerged from the Tower gates, the air shifted. The murmurs of the crowd rippled, some in pity, some in contempt, some in awe. The soldiers flanking her formed a corridor of steel, their spears upright, gleaming like cold trees in a forest of iron. Their faces were stern but not untouched by discomfort, for even hardened men could not help but feel the gravity of leading a queen to her death. The people stared. Some muttered prayers beneath their breath. Others whispered cruel words, delighting in her downfall. Yet there were those who looked upon her with admiration, struck by the courage etched upon her pale face. She walked calmly, her steps measured, each footfall echoing across the stones as if she were writing her epitaph with sound. The scaffold loomed ahead, its timbers darkened with age, its boards groaning under the weight of expectation. The executioner, brought from Calais for his skill and swiftness, waited patiently, his blade hidden beneath his cloak. Around the scaffold, nobles had gathered in their finery, their faces carefully composed masks of solemnity, though behind their eyes flickered the thrill of court politics. For many of them, Anne's death was not tragedy but opportunity. The crowd swelled in restless silence as Anne ascended the steps. The air itself seemed to contract, pulling every breath, every heartbeat into this singular moment. She paused briefly, looking over the sea of faces. Faces of the very people who had once cheered her coronation, who had once hailed her as the mother of the future of England. Now they waited to see her stripped not only of her crown but of her life. And yet, in this moment, Anne was luminous. The morning sun broke weakly through the fog, casting a faint light across her figure, and for a heartbeat, she seemed less like a condemned traitor and more like a saint carved in human form. She began to speak, her voice steady, carrying across the stillness. Her words were not of bitterness or accusation. They were words of humility, of loyalty to her king, and of resignation to God's will. History would remember them not as the cries of a desperate woman, but as the final testament of a queen determined to meet her end with courage. The people listened, some nodding, others shaking their heads. The soldiers remained motionless, though a few blinked hard, fighting tears they dared not shed. Even the wind seemed to hush, as if the very elements bent to hear her. The scaffold floor creaked beneath her as she knelt, folding her gown neatly around her so as not to expose herself in death. Her ladies in waiting, their faces pale and stricken, stood close by, trembling but obedient in their service to the very last. The crowd drew in a collective breath. The executioner stepped forward, silent and efficient, his face unreadable. Anne closed her eyes briefly, lips moving in prayer, then opened them once more, lifting her gaze skyward. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. This was not just the end of Anne Boleyn. It was the death of a dream, the closing of a chapter in England's turbulent history, and the birth of a legend that would haunt the nation for centuries. And in the chill of that morning, with the fog curling like ghostly fingers around the scaffold, the world seemed to pause, as though all of England held its breath for what was about to come. Anne Boleyn's downfall was not a single strike of fate, but a slow unraveling of loyalty, desire, and ruthless ambition. To understand the scaffold that awaited her on May 19, 1536, one must first step back into the glittering court that had once been her stage. Years earlier, Anne had been the object of King Henry VIII's consuming passion. She was not the quiet, obedient consort expected of queens, but a woman of wit, intelligence, and fire. She dared to resist him, dared to demand more than fleeting affection. It was her determination that drove Henry to break with Rome, to sever centuries of Catholic tradition, and to crown her his queen. Together, they had challenged an empire of faith and rewritten the map of Christendom. But passion that burns too brightly soon becomes unstable. By 1536, that fire had cooled into ash. Henry's gaze had drifted toward Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting with a demure charm and the quiet submission Anne lacked. Jane's softness contrasted with Anne's sharpness, and Henry, ever restless, began to crave simplicity after years of conflict and scandal. What had once drawn him to Anne, her strength, her refusal to bend, had become a thorn in his pride. At the heart of Anne's undoing stood Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister. Once her ally, Cromwell had turned against her when their visions of power clashed. Anne sought to use her influence to guide foreign policy and religious reform, but Cromwell saw her interference as a threat to his control. In the dangerous chessboard of Tudor politics, the Queen herself became a pawn to be sacrificed. The first whispers came quietly, sliding like poison into the corridors of Whitehall. Murmurs of infidelity, of treasonous plots, of secret lovers hidden in the Queen's chambers. It mattered little whether such rumors had substance. In a court where survival depended on pleasing the king, whispers could become verdicts overnight. Anne's enemies accused her of liaisons with men of her household, even of treason with her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were grotesque, unthinkable, yet carefully crafted to wound Henry's pride and to strip Anne of every shred of dignity. The Queen who had once been celebrated as the mother of reform was painted as a wanton seductress, a danger to the throne, a curse upon the king. Henry, whether through genuine belief or deliberate blindness, embraced these accusations with terrifying speed. Perhaps he truly felt betrayed. Perhaps he simply desired freedom to wed Jane Seymour without the stain of annulment. Whatever his reasoning, his resolve was merciless. The woman for whom he had defied popes and emperors was now to be destroyed. The arrests began like a storm breaking over the court. Musicians, courtiers, gentlemen, all dragged into the Tower, accused of crimes as absurd as they were damning. George Boleyn, Anne's beloved brother, was taken too, his loyalty twisted into the shape of treason. The Tower filled with fear, the walls echoing with cries of men who had once basked in the Queen's favor. Anne herself was seized on May 2, 1536. She was playing a game of tennis when the king's men approached her with grave expressions. The game ended, the rackets fell silent, and history shifted. She was led away, bewildered, insisting on her innocence, yet already understanding that innocence was no shield against the machinery of power. In the Tower, she wrote letters to Henry, pleading, questioning, reminding him of their vows, of the daughter they shared, Elizabeth, the child she loved fiercely. But the king did not answer. His silence was the loudest verdict of all. Anne's words, filled with anguish and dignity, would be preserved not as pleas to a lover, but as the testimony of a woman betrayed by the man for whom she had risked everything. Meanwhile, Cromwell orchestrated the trial with chilling precision. Witnesses were coerced, confessions extracted, stories twisted into weapons. The outcome was never in doubt. Anne's fall was not about justice, but about convenience. Her death would free Henry's hand, cleanse his conscience, and cement Cromwell's authority. And so, before noble peers and judges bound not by truth but by loyalty to the king, Anne was condemned. She was guilty not only of imagined lovers, but of daring to be too powerful, too outspoken, too impossible to control. Outside the courtroom, Jane Seymour waited quietly, her star rising as Anne's plummeted. Within days, she would be betrothed to the king, her meek smile hiding the truth that her throne was built upon another woman's grave. The fall of Anne Boleyn was more than the destruction of a queen. It was the unmasking of a system where power was a fickle master, where love was currency, and where even the crown itself offered no protection. By the time Anne awaited her final morning, she was no longer the queen who had defied Rome. She was a lesson written in flesh and blood, a warning to every woman who might dream of influence in a world ruled by men. And so the stage was set. The crowd that gathered at the Tower was not simply there to watch her die. They came to see the triumph of politics over passion, the execution of a dream that had once dared to burn too brightly. If Anne Boleyn's downfall began with Henry's waning passion, it was Thomas Cromwell who spun the net that tightened around her neck. His weapon was not steel, but whispers. His battlefield was not open ground, but the hidden corridors of Whitehall, where shadows carried secrets and secrets carried death. Cromwell was a master of survival. He had risen from humble origins, an ironsmith's son turned lawyer, soldier, merchant, and finally the king's indispensable minister. He knew that power was not inherited but crafted, thread by thread, like the web of a patient spider. And in Anne Boleyn, he saw both a threat and an opportunity. Anne, once his ally, had begun to oppose his policies. She meddled in matters of state, pressing Henry to act against Cromwell's interests in religion and foreign alliances. In another world, their conflict might have remained political. But in the treacherous waters of Tudor court, politics was life and death. Cromwell chose death for Anne. The accusations began in whispers. A flirtatious remark here, a glance misinterpreted there. At court, where every word could be twisted, gossip was a dagger sharper than any blade. Cromwell collected rumors the way a general gathers troops, molding them into a narrative that would damn the queen. The men named as her lovers were carefully chosen. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, was of low birth, easily intimidated. Under pressure, he confessed, whether through fear, torture, or the promise of mercy, no one can say. His words became the cornerstone of Cromwell's case, though they were as fragile as smoke. Then came Sir Henry Norris, one of Henry's closest friends. His loyalty to the king should have shielded him, but Cromwell understood the power of betrayal. To claim that Anne had ensnared even Norris was to strike at Henry's pride, to humiliate him before his court. Francis Weston and William Brereton followed, their supposed crimes painted in lurid detail. And finally, George Boleyn, Anne's own brother, was accused of the unspeakable, incest, treason woven together in a tapestry of lies designed to strip Anne not only of her crown, but of her humanity. The trials were theater. Evidence mattered little, spectacle mattered most. In Westminster Hall, nobles gathered as though attending a performance. The charges were read aloud, shocking the court with their scandalous implications. Anne was accused of luring men into her chambers, of conspiring to kill the king, of polluting the very throne with her treachery. The more outrageous the claims, the more they thrilled Henry's courtiers, who nodded solemnly while privately savoring the queen's ruin. Anne defended herself with eloquence, her words clear and firm, her wit as sharp as ever. She denied every charge, and those who listened could not help but recognize the weakness of the accusations. Yet recognition was meaningless. The verdict had been written before the trial began. The guilty sentences fell like hammer blows. Smeaton, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and George Boleyn, all condemned. Their deaths would precede Anne's, softening the ground for the queen's own destruction. One by one, they were led to the scaffold, their blood soaking the earth, their bodies left as grim reminders of Cromwell's efficiency. But even in death, the lies clung like a shroud. The men were remembered not as loyal servants, but as conspirators in Anne's supposed treachery. History itself had been twisted, reshaped by the cunning of a single man. In the Tower, Anne felt the weight of this web closing around her. She was no fool. She understood that her enemies were not merely seeking her removal, but her erasure. To kill her was one thing, to paint her as a monster was another. Cromwell wanted more than her death. He wanted her legacy destroyed. Yet Anne refused to give him that satisfaction. In her final days, she maintained her composure, speaking with calmness to her ladies, praying with devotion, even offering forgiveness to those who had wronged her. Her dignity was her last weapon, and she wielded it with a grace that no web of lies could fully conceal. For Cromwell, the success was complete. He had not only eliminated a rival, but secured his power with Henry. The king, convinced, or perhaps willing to be convinced, of Anne's guilt, prepared to take Jane Seymour as his new bride. The machinery of politics had worked flawlessly, grinding Anne's life to dust. But history has a way of unraveling lies, thread by thread. Even as Anne awaited her death, the truth was already slipping through the cracks. Those who had known her, those who had served her, carried memories that would outlast Cromwell's schemes. And in the years to come, the daughter she bore, Elizabeth, would rise to the throne, casting her mother's shadow long across England. Still, in May of 1536, the lies ruled. And on those lies, a queen would die. The machinery of Anne Boleyn's destruction did not stop at whispers. Whispers alone could not carry a queen to the scaffold. For that, arrests were required, public, shocking, and meticulously staged. On May 2, 1536, the queen herself was seized. She had been playing a game of tennis when the king's men appeared, their faces grim, their words final. The courtly laughter around the court faded into silence as the rackets fell still. The queen's handmaids watched in horror as Anne was escorted away, bewildered yet composed, her lips whispering, "I am the king's true wife." From that moment, her world narrowed to the cold stone walls of the Tower of London. But she was not alone in her fall. The arrests swept through the court like a storm, striking down men who only days before had basked in royal favor. Mark Smeaton, the musician whose songs had once brought joy to banquets, was taken first. Of low birth, he was the easiest target, the easiest to break. Under the weight of interrogation, and perhaps under the hand of torture, he confessed to the impossible. His words, likely wrung from him through fear or agony, became the cornerstone of Cromwell's case. Next came Sir Henry Norris, the king's close friend and trusted groom of the stool. He had shared Henry's secrets, attended his councils, stood by him in moments of triumph and despair. Yet in an instant, friendship was discarded. Norris was accused of betraying the very man he had served with such devotion. Francis Weston and William Brereton followed, their names added to the swelling list of supposed conspirators. Their fates were sealed not by proof, but by the convenience of their downfall. Each arrest lent weight to the illusion of guilt, each man another thread woven into Cromwell's fabric of lies. And then there was George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. His arrest was not merely political, it was meant to humiliate, to strip Anne of every shred of respectability. To accuse a queen of incest was to paint her as not just unfaithful, but unnatural, unholy, damned. The tower filled with prisoners. Behind its walls, once the fortress of kings, now stood the shattered remnants of Anne's circle. Each man awaited his fate in silence, the echo of their footsteps on stone the only reminder that they were still alive. The trials were no trials at all, but theater performed on a grand stage. In Westminster Hall, nobles gathered in their finery, their eyes eager, their whispers sharp. They knew the outcome before a word was spoken, yet they came to witness the spectacle, to cloak injustice in the robes of ceremony. Anne stood before them, pale but unbroken. She denied every charge with clarity, her voice carrying through the hall. Her wit, once the delight of the court, now cut like a blade against the lies laid before her. But truth had no place in this performance. The verdict had already been written, sealed not by evidence but by the will of a king who desired her gone. Mark Smeaton, the broken musician, testified against her. His words were shaky, uncertain, yet they were accepted as gospel. George Boleyn defended himself with eloquence, exposing the absurdity of the charges, but eloquence mattered little. The peers of the realm, men sworn to uphold justice, nodded along as if justice had been served. One by one, guilty sentences fell upon the accused. Death awaited them all, some by the sword, others by the rope. The court recorded their names not as loyal servants, but as traitors. The ink of history was tainted that day, blotting out the truth with convenient lies. The executions came swiftly. On May 17, the men were led to the scaffold. The crowd watched as they confessed sins they had not committed, seeking forgiveness from a God who surely knew the truth. Swords fell, ropes tightened, bodies crumpled. The ground drank their blood, the air carried their final cries, and the tower stood unmoved, its stones indifferent to human suffering. Anne remained alive, but her fate was sealed. The trial had been the climax of Cromwell's play, the verdict the final act. She was guilty not because she had betrayed her king, but because her king wished it so. In the days that followed, as the tower grew quieter, Anne prepared for her own end. She spoke gently to her ladies, prayed with fervor, and even joked with a grim humor that startled those around her. She told one attendant that she would soon be rid of her torment, soon ascending to a place where no lies could touch her. Yet the world outside was not silent. London buzzed with gossip, with arguments whispered in taverns and markets. Some believed the charges, others doubted, but few dared to speak openly. For in Tudor England, to question the king's justice was to invite the same fate as those who had already perished. The trials had done their work. The stage was set. The queen would die, and with her death, Henry would be free to wed again, free to pursue the simplicity he craved. The machinery of politics had turned, grinding truth into dust, and all that remained was the final execution of a woman who had once changed the world. The days that followed Anne Boleyn's trial were not marked by noise, but by silence, the heavy, suffocating silence of inevitability. Within the Tower of London, where kings and traitors alike had drawn their final breaths, Anne prepared to meet her fate. Her chamber was small, its stone walls cold even in May. A single narrow window looked out upon the green where the scaffold was being raised. She could not see it directly, but she could hear the echo of hammers, the creak of timber, the murmured orders of workmen. Each sound was a grim reminder. The stage of her death was being built plank by plank. Anne's ladies-in-waiting never left her side. They whispered prayers, brushed her hair, folded her gowns, but their hands trembled, and their eyes were red with tears. Anne, by contrast, was steady. At times she even spoke with a startling wit, joking that her neck was slender and the executioner would not need to work hard. Her dark humor shocked her attendants, yet it revealed something profound. She would not allow fear to strip her of dignity. At night, she prayed. Her words carried through the chamber, soft but unwavering. She prayed for her daughter Elizabeth, too young to understand the storm that had torn her family apart. She prayed for her brother George, whose death had already stained the tower with grief. And, astonishingly, she prayed for Henry, the man who had once sworn to love her forever, who now sought her destruction. The tower itself seemed to watch her. Its walls held centuries of secrets, and now they absorbed her whispers, her footsteps, her restless sighs. Guards passed by her door with measured tread, their armor clinking like chains of fate. To them, she was no longer queen, but prisoner number one, awaiting the justice of the king. News of the men's executions reached her swiftly. On May 17, she learned that Smeaton, Norris, Weston, Brereton, and George had all been put to death. Some beheaded, others hanged, their bodies displayed as tokens of the king's wrath. Anne wept for her brother, for her companions, but her tears did not last long. She gathered herself, lifted her chin, and whispered that she too would soon be free. In those final days, visitors came, not friends, but officials ensuring that protocol was observed. The constable of the Tower, Sir William Kingston, recorded her words with dutiful precision, noting her calmness, her strength, her startling ability to joke in the face of annihilation. To him she said, "Never had I wished to die until now, nor ever received death with better will." Yet the human beneath the composure revealed itself in fleeting moments. When alone with her ladies, she would touch the wooden table, the cold stone floor, as if memorizing the feel of the world she would soon leave behind. She spoke of Elizabeth, lamenting that the girl would grow up motherless, but also declaring that one day, her daughter would rise higher than any had ever imagined. In those words lay a prophecy, for Elizabeth would indeed one day wear the crown her mother lost. Outside the Tower, London seethed with gossip. Some pitied Anne, whispering that she was a victim of politics. Others mocked her, saying she had earned her fall through pride and ambition. Yet even those who despised her could not help but marvel at her courage. She was no longer the glittering queen of banquets and coronations. She was a woman standing at the edge of eternity, and in that, she commanded respect. On May 18, the day before her death, Anne made her confession. To the chaplain, she swore upon her soul that she had never been unfaithful, never betrayed the king. Her words rang with sincerity, and though it changed nothing, it left a mark upon history. For centuries to come, scholars would debate her guilt, but in that moment, Anne herself declared her innocence with the calm of one who stood before God. That night, she prepared as if for a final audience. She chose a gown of dark damask, modest yet dignified, and arranged her headdress with care. She spoke softly to her attendants, thanking them for their loyalty, blessing them for their service. She asked them not to weep on the morrow, for she would go to God with joy. Sleep did not come easily. The night stretched long, filled with the tolling of distant bells, the muffled cries of birds on the river, the whisper of wind through stone. But when dawn finally came, Anne was ready. The final day had arrived, and in her last hours she carried herself not as a condemned criminal, but as a queen who had chosen to meet her fate with grace. Her courage was her legacy, her composure her final act of defiance. For when she stepped out of her chamber that morning, she stepped not into shame, but into immortality. The morning of May 19, 1536, arrived at last, the day that had been whispered about in taverns, feared in chambers, and anticipated with a strange hunger by the people of London. From the first light of dawn, the city seemed to shudder awake, its heartbeat heavy, deliberate, echoing through the fog that clung to the cobblestones. This was no ordinary day. It was a day when a queen would die. At the Tower of London, preparations had been made with careful precision. The scaffold, broad and sturdy, stood upon the green, its timbers freshly cut, its surface washed clean yet still smelling of sap and iron. The crowd gathered early, a sea of faces pressed shoulder to shoulder, from ragged peasants craning their necks to noblemen in velvet robes who tried to mask their curiosity with solemn expressions. Soldiers formed lines like iron walls, their pikes glinting beneath the weak morning sun. The executioner had come from Calais, a man renowned for his swiftness and skill. Unlike the brutal axes of England, his weapon was the sword, a blade honed to a perfect edge. He waited quietly, his presence both dreaded and strangely reassuring, for those who had seen the clumsy hacking of lesser men knew that Anne's death would at least be merciful in its speed. Anne herself emerged from her chamber with calm dignity. She wore a gown of deep damask, simple yet regal, and her headdress framed a face pale but serene. Around her walked her ladies in waiting, their hands trembling, their eyes wet with grief. As she stepped into the open air, the crowd murmured, the sound rising like a tide. Some cursed her as a traitor. Others whispered prayers for her soul. Many simply stared, unable to reconcile the woman before them with the monster painted by the trial. She ascended the steps to the scaffold slowly, each movement deliberate, each footstep echoing against the hush of the crowd. When she reached the platform, she turned to face the sea of faces. For a moment, she stood in silence, letting the weight of the moment settle. Then she spoke. Her words were measured, her voice carrying clearly across the still air. She declared her loyalty to the king, praised his mercy, and asked the crowd to pray for her soul. There was no bitterness, no accusation. Only dignity, humility, and an almost otherworldly calm. It was as if she knew that her final act would define her legacy far more than the lies that had condemned her. Her speech ended, and the hush deepened. The executioner stepped forward, bowing with respect. Anne removed her headdress and unclasped her gown at the neck. One of her ladies stepped forward, hands shaking, to bind her eyes with a linen cloth. Anne knelt gracefully upon the scaffold, arranging her skirts so as not to expose herself in death. Even in this, she clung to her dignity. The crowd held its breath. The silence was total, oppressive, broken only by the caw of a raven circling above. Anne's lips moved in silent prayer. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul, she whispered. The executioner lifted his sword, stepping lightly into position. But he did not strike immediately. Instead, he called out to a guard to fetch his weapon, distracting Anne for the briefest instant. As her head turned slightly in confusion, the blade flashed through the air. It was done in a heartbeat. One swift stroke. No scream, no struggle. The queen who had once defied Rome, who had captivated a king and changed the course of England's history, was no more. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Some wept openly. Others crossed themselves. A few whispered that justice had been served. But for many, there was only shock at the speed, the finality, the enormity of what had just occurred. Her ladies rushed forward, gathering her body, cradling it with trembling arms. They placed her remains in a simple wooden chest, unmarked, unadorned. No crown, no jewels, no procession. A queen of England buried like a commoner. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring, whispering, carrying the tale to every corner of London. Within hours, the city would buzz with the story of how Anne Boleyn had met her death, calm, composed, defiant in her dignity. And within days, Henry VIII would be betrothed to Jane Seymour, as though one life could so easily be replaced by another. Yet for those who witnessed it, the memory of that morning would never fade. The pale figure kneeling upon the scaffold, the silence before the stroke, the flash of the sword, and the haunting realization that they had seen not just a woman die, but the extinguishing of a dream. Anne Boleyn's execution was not merely the end of her life. It was the birth of a legend that would haunt England for centuries, a ghost that even stone walls and royal decree. Anne Boleyn's body had been taken from the scaffold in a simple wooden chest, carried away without crown, without procession, without the honor befitting a queen. Yet death, though it silenced her voice, could not erase her presence. In truth, Anne did not vanish on May 19, 1536. She transformed. The Tower of London held her memory like a shadow etched into its very stones. Guards whispered of her ghost, drifting through the corridors where she had prayed, where she had walked to the scaffold. Some swore they heard the echo of her final words in the chill of the night. Others claimed to see her pale figure gliding along the battlements, head tucked beneath her arm, a spectral queen who refused to be forgotten. Whether such visions were real or imagined, they spoke to a deeper truth. Anne Boleyn haunted England not as a spirit, but as a legacy. For Henry VIII, her death was supposed to be an ending. He married Jane Seymour within days, moving swiftly as if to erase Anne's memory with the promise of a new wife, a new heir. Yet even as Jane bore him a son, Henry could never fully escape the shadow of Anne. She lingered in the whispers of courtiers, in the doubts of foreign ambassadors, in the conscience of a king who had once torn a nation apart to possess her. And then there was Elizabeth, the daughter Anne left behind, barely 3 years old when her mother died. Declared illegitimate, pushed aside, Elizabeth might have been erased from history. But blood is stubborn, and destiny more stubborn still. In time, she would ascend to the throne, reigning longer than any Tudor before her. Elizabeth I carried not only the crown but the fire of her mother's spirit. Sharp-witted, unyielding, regal, Elizabeth became the living proof that Anne's story did not end on the scaffold. Historians would argue for centuries over Anne's guilt or innocence. Was she truly the victim of a political coup, framed by Cromwell to satisfy Henry's shifting desires? Or had she indeed overreached, daring to play the game of power too boldly in a world that had no patience for a woman's ambition? The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. But what cannot be denied is the impact of her life and death. She reshaped the very structure of England, igniting the flames of religious reform, altering the line of succession, and leaving behind a daughter who would define an era. Anne's story resonates not simply because of its tragedy, but because of its humanity. She was not a saint, nor a demon. She was a woman of flesh and blood, brilliant and flawed, caught in the ruthless machinery of power. She loved, she fought, she lost. And in the end, she died with courage that turned her into legend. The scaffold on Tower Green rotted away, the crowds dispersed, the king remarried. But Anne remained, in poems, in chronicles, in the imagination of a nation. Her execution became a symbol of injustice, of the dangers of unchecked power, of the cost of ambition in a world ruled by men. And even now, nearly 5 centuries later, her story is told and retold, each generation finding in it a mirror for its own struggles. Some see in Anne the victim of patriarchal cruelty. Others see a political player who lost the game. But all agree that she haunts history, her presence is sharp and enduring as the blade that took her life. The tower still stands, its stones cold and silent, but if you listen closely, you might hear her footsteps echoing through the halls. You might see, in the corner of your vision, the flicker of a dark gown, the gleam of a pale face, the whisper of a prayer carried on the wind. Whether ghost or memory, Anne Boleyn endures. She endures in Elizabeth, in the Reformation she helped shape, in the very identity of England itself. She endures because her story reminds us of a truth that cannot be silenced. Power is fleeting, crowns are fragile, but courage, even in death, echoes forever. Anne Boleyn's execution was meant to erase her. Instead, it immortalized her.